Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. Does EPCRA reporting apply to you? This is Kevin and I'll be moderating the event today. I'd like to go over a few items before we jump into our presentation. In efforts to minimize background noise, we have muted all phone lines. We encourage questions and comments throughout the presentation using the chat box located on the left-hand side of your screen. This applies to any technical assistance you may need, as well as submitting questions about the information covered. I'd like to introduce our presenter for today, Mr. Mike Zimmerman, Principal Consultant. So now I'm going to hand it over so we can get started.
Thank you very much. This is Mike Zimmerman. I work for BSI, EHS Services and Solutions. I'm just going to give a quick intro of my background before we get started. I am a registered professional chemical engineer in 5 states, and I have been doing EHS engineering and consulting for over 32 years, with my primary expertise being on the West Coast and the last couple of years in Texas. I also worked around the U.S. and around the world, so this presentation we're going to do today is going to be kind of more general in nature for facilities or that are located around the U.S. As we get started, though, I wanted to kind of get an idea of the expertise of those on the call, so I can kind of have an idea of how much to just kind of start at kind of a ground level versus kind of talking more intermediate level. So if you could you fill out the survey that's on your screen? Let us know whether you think you're expert, intermediate, limited knowledge, or never heard of EPCRA before. Okay. Great. Hopefully you can kind of see. It looks like we actually have quite a big mix here. We have almost half are in the limited knowledge, and the other half are in intermediate or expert. So what we're going to talk about today, I think, will help all of the levels that we're talking about. But that is kind of good to know who we have on the call and how to proceed. I do also have some slides that are related to some specific states, one being Texas because I'm currently in Texas, and the other California because there are some specific California requirements out there. And I can touch on those either a little bit more or a little bit less based on whether those of you on the call have sites that are in California or Texas. And you can also kind of put in the chat, maybe we can talk about other sites too if we have time. So please fill out this second polling question. Okay. So most of you not in California or Texas, just a few limited California locations. So again, we'll kind of gloss over that information. We'll talk more general about the federal requirements, which are pretty standard in most of the other states. There are some states that do have specific reporting programs online or other small nuances, but for the most part, most states follow along with what I'm going to be discussing today. This is the outline for what we're going to talk about in today's webinar. First of all, kind of just a brief intro to what types of EPCRA reports apply to most of our clients out there. And then we're going to spend some time on the EPCRA Tier 2 report, which is due just in a few weeks, March 1st. We have a couple FAQs, for example, on reporting of lead acid batteries. Then we have the EPCRA TRI reports, which are due July 1st. P2 plans, which are actually a Texas thing, so we may just gloss over that. And then we're going to talk about some compliance tools for working with EPCRA and doing EPCRA reporting. Let me jump into the why EPCRA is a law that's out there. It's not a regulation. So anything that, like EPCRA, RCRA, Clean Air Act, anything with the word act at the end is a law that's out there. And so there are different things in the law that were enacted for a couple of reasons. One was to inform communities and first responders about the chemicals in their communities. Another was to involve the communities and first responders in developing kind of emergency planning and response. Without them knowing what chemicals are out there, it's hard for them to know whether they need to have a special team or special training for ammonia or for hydrogen fluoride or another specialty chemical like that. It helps identify facilities that might be subject to the law. That helps the agencies know who they might want to go visit and do compliance visits with. The 4 basic EPCRA programs that are out there have sections 301, 304, 311, 313, as you see here on the screen. The 304, the second one, actually has reporting requirements if you have a release that's over what's called a reportable quantity, a certain number of pounds of a release. We're not going to deal with or talk about the first 2 here. We're going to focus on the 311, 312, and 313 requirements. The 311, 312 is what's also known as the Tier 2 form. That's the one that is due March 1st and requires facilities that have safety data sheets, or SDSs, above a certain threshold to submit their inventory to the local agencies, the state agencies, etc. The 313 is what's called the toxic release inventory, and that is another one that requires submittal, and that's the one that's due July 1st. So now we'll get into a little bit more detail about some of those. But here's like a list of some of the common facilities that have to report under EPCRA. Anything from manufacturing facilities, schools, colleges, state government, federal government, agriculture. There are some smaller sites, like you see gas stations, auto repair shops, and warehouses that may have to report. And a lot of the things that capture those smaller or less, non-manufacturing facilities are things like the diesel fuel and gasoline on site. So we're talking here about the Form R and what triggers you to have to report. Again, if you have chemicals on site that have a safety data sheet, that require a safety data sheet, then they're known as a hazardous substance, and that would be one that you would have to compare to the thresholds. Again, this third bullet is kind of a key one, that you want to put yourself in the first responder shoes. The fact that the local fire departments and local response agencies will actually look at this data and evaluate it before making an emergency call to a facility is important. They need to know what hazardous materials are there, what are the volumes, are they in pressure vessels, are they in atmospheric containers, are they indoors, outdoors. A lot of these things will impact the emergency response of first responders. This is a table that summarizes the thresholds for the reporting thresholds for each of those areas. The 302 and 304, like I said, we're not going to focus on too much, but 311 and 312, which is the Tier 2, you can see that the thresholds are 500 pounds or what's called a threshold planning quantity, TPQ, for extremely hazardous substances, or if you have gasoline greater than or equal to 75,000 gallons, or diesel greater than 100,000 gallons. And then if you have a compound that's not an EHS, not diesel or gasoline, then if you have greater than 10,000 pounds of that chemical on site, you will need to complete a Form R and submit it to your state and or the feds. Under the Section 313, the TRI, the limitations are as listed there, and there is a specific list for 313 chemicals. Some of these lists actually differ between 313, 311. You really are looking not so much a list, but you're looking at whether an SDS is required for your chemical, where on the 313, there's a specific published list you compare to. And if you have over 25,000 pounds per year you manufacture on site, or 10,000 pounds that you use in another manner, then you might be subject to the 313. There are some other criteria we're going to talk about, like the SIC code. We'll get into that in a little bit. A lot of times you see these acronyms, the SERCs, TERCs, LEPCs. What are they? The SERC is the state agency for emergency response. Each state has one. I've seen some as the OES, like in California they're called. There's the LEPC, which is the local planning committee. Some are actual fire departments. Some are made up of a larger entity. Just depends on what state you're in and how big and what the population centers are in that state, whether you might have one that might just be a fire department or one that might be a large county agency. And then a TERC is a Tribal Emergency Response Council, a commission. Got council on the mind. Here were some recent updates as far as 2 years ago that apply. The more important one was there was a reporting exemption for air emissions from animal waste at farms if you have a farming type agricultural facility. One thing to note, there are some actual steep costs for violating the EPCRA reporting requirements. Fines from anywhere from $10,000 to $82,500 per day, criminal penalties, facility closures, negative press, and damage to the corporate image. The key thing is most of these types of things, the agency will work with you first before they start implementing fines and criminal penalties or closing down a facility. But obviously, a facility that does not comply repeatedly over time, then your agency may be subject to implementing one or more of these. I think that was pretty basic. We're going to move on to the next section here. Tier 2 reporting, the ones that are due March 1st. This is kind of a summary. What I went over real quickly earlier, but kind of gives it a little bit easier. If you have 10,000 pounds of a hazardous chemical that needs an SES, you might have to report. Or if you're EHS, extremely hazardous substance, or you have the gasoline or diesel. So some questions here. Sometimes when you're reporting some information about your facility, you're reporting basically your address, your hazardous materials on site, the locations, the quantities, the chemical makeup of a product, whether it has sulfuric acid or ammonia or lead or another hazardous substance in it. In the past, some people would submit the full copy of the safety data sheet, and that just overwhelmed agencies, as you can kind of see in the graphic image here on the right. So more agencies and the feds and the states have gone to implementing some type of a chemical list that you submit with a summary of the hazards. You'll use specific codes specific to that state or the feds to identify fire hazard, whether it's a sudden release of pressure, reactivity, immediate acute or delayed chronic health hazards. So please don't send your safety data sheets in, send in the summary forms, and then if the agency does want a safety data sheet, especially for something new to their area that they're not familiar with, they may ask for it specifically. There are two types of reports under the 311, 312 that are called Tier 1 and Tier 2. Tier 2 is the most common. That's the one that I've been describing. There is a smaller Tier 1 report, but very few agencies actually require that one. So we're going to focus today on the Tier 2. But again, it's very similar, your site information and the chemicals on site. There are some variations out there by state when you start providing the information for a Tier 2. Some states, more than 20, actually assess a fee when you file the Tier 2 on their online system. Some states require interim updates. Oregon and Pennsylvania are two examples. In Oregon, the reporting deadline actually varies from county to county. Some other states too. California does the same thing where they have a March 1st deadline, but some of what are called the counties or CUPAs there say if you amended your Form R, which is called the HMBP there, if you did it in January, then next January you need to resubmit it. So there are some states that have different deadlines. For the most part, states do have a March 1 deadline. There are some states in the last bullet here too that have lower reporting thresholds. Again, some of the ones you see listed here. This is just an example of some things where you would submit if you were in Texas. I know there's no Texas sites, but you'll see your state will have a program or an online system where you'll go in, you'll fill out the information and submit it online. You'll have to certify that the information is accurate and then hit submit. And as a consultant, we've done a number of these for clients where we go in, we fill out the information for them, and then the client goes in and hits submit once they've reviewed the information. Some of the LEPCs require that you email a PDF of the report to them, and also some of the fire departments. So it is key when you're doing your online reporting to, sometimes it'll give you an option to save as a PDF. That is a very important thing to do, to keep a copy at your site in case the person who has the login leaves. You at least have a copy of what was submitted, and you can show it to a local agency if they come and audit your facility. Or if your company does corporate internal audits, you can have that print out and show them also. Again, the deadline for the Tier 2 typically across the U.S. is March 1st. There are some penalties that can be incurred if you submit late. Sometimes just working with your state agency, you can have a little extra time because they may be bogged down themselves on March 1st. Here's some kind of lessons learned for our clients out there related to both Form R, Tier 2, and then the TRI reporting we're going to talk about. Keep accurate records. It's always good to have a chemical inventory on your site, the names and quantities of the chemicals. I know some sites have thousands and thousands of chemicals. It's hard to keep that up to date, but at least if you have something that's a snapshot in time, it's a good starting point. Some clients have electronic systems with SKUs that they can kind of track drums or shipments in and out, and it can automatically update a chemical inventory. Those are pretty handy if you have that ability. You'll want to track chemicals by their chemical abstract service number, the CAPS number as it is called. It's good to identify whether it's a hazardous chemical or an extremely hazardous substance. And you want to know the maximum quantity present at the facility in pounds. Even something like diesel and gasoline, they have a volumetric quantity of gallons, but that can be converted pretty easily to pounds using the specific gravity and or density of the material. And then you'll want to keep up-to-date emergency contact information for your site and for the off-site contacts for fire department, state water resources, air resources, Haz Waste Division, etc. There are some exclusions for reporting chemicals on the Tier 2 form. Two key ones that I have highlighted in yellow here you'll see are hazardous waste. Typically doesn't get reported on there. In California it does, so again, this is a state-specific thing. Another, it comes down to a consumer product or hazardous substance. An example could be, let's say you have a facility that has 1,000 one-pint containers of motor oil on site that they're selling. It could be, like at a large retail facility or even a really large gas station or auto parts store. If those are all consumer products in consumer-sized containers, those would be typically exempt from the Form R reporting. Again, there are some states that go above and beyond and want you to report that. They see that material could act in in the summation, if there was a significant release, that all the containers could be released at once and you could have a significant event. But for the most part, federally and most states around the U.S., things that are in a consumer-sized container that are consumer products are exempt from being counted towards your threshold quantities. Here's a topic that comes up a lot for our clients related to how to report lead-acid batteries for the Form R. And the lead-acid batteries are in several different forms. We've got a number of clients that have forklifts with large lead-acid batteries that are run on battery as opposed to diesel or propane. There's also large batteries for man lifts and other equipment on site. Obviously, vehicles could have lead-acid batteries, but if it's in a vehicle that it's just the starting mechanism, that would be a consumer product type or article type product, and those are typically not required to be listed under Form R. But if you do have quite a number of lead-acid batteries on site, then you should evaluate using some of the information like I've given here on the screen. And I have a client that has large lead-acid batteries for their forklifts, and really with just 2 of those forklift batteries, they're pretty close to exceeding the thresholds here. So let me kind of go over this. If you can pull up safety data sheets or manufacturer spec sheets for the batteries, you can usually identify how many pounds or gallons of sulfuric acid are in the batteries. Again, if it's in gallons, you'll have to convert to pounds. If you're over 500 pounds, then you would have to report because sulfuric acid is a extremely hazardous substance in EHS, and we use that lower limit. Then you would look at the total amount of lead in the batteries. If your amount of lead is over the 10,000, you would have to report. If you're over one of these and under the other, you still have to report, obviously, because one of them exceeds the threshold. EPA and a lot of the states actually allow you to report the lead-acid batteries as one single item, and then you just list, let's say you listed it, and you list the sulfuric acid as a component. So let me go to the next slide here, and there's a little bit more follow-up. So let's say you have a lot of lead-acid batteries, and they're just stored at the facility for some reason. If they're there and they're not being used, like I said, the starter batteries for a vehicle, you get a number of those stored on site that you exceed the limit. If you summed all that up, you would be subject to Tier 2. Again, here's the California requirement. We do have some people with California facilities, so one thing to note, California does require reporting them at a lower limit than the federal. It's 55 gallons for the sulfuric acid and 500 pounds for the lead. And they too, like the federal, do want you to list it as a single item and list the sulfuric acid as a component. And there is a template on the California online system that'll help you fill this out. In the California and even in the federal program, there are some kind of rules of thumb that you assume. I'm trying to remember the exact amount. There's a certain percentage of a battery that you're going to assume is lead. I think it's 80%, just because the lead is so heavy. So if sometimes the battery will have a weight on the outside, say 2,000 pounds, you'll assume that 1,600 pounds is lead and the remaining 400 pounds is the sulfuric acid. Any questions on the batteries and dealing with EPCRA Form Rs? Okay. I don't see any questions on here, so I'll move on. The next EPCRA EPCRA report we're going to talk about is the Section 313, the TRI, which is due July 1st each year. I've given a little bit of intro to this. This is a report that summarizes how much material you had leave the facility, and they call it a release. Even if it leaves as a waste, that's a release. If it leaves as an air emission, that's a release. If it leaves in a wastewater discharge, that would be a release. So the TRI program tracks the management of only certain chemicals that can pose a threat to the human health and the environment. Again, this is one where the EPCRA has a list of the 650 chemicals you need to compare to, and compare using the 10,000 and the 25,000 limit that we're going to talk about again. In general, the chemicals that are covered by TRI are those that cause one or more of the following. It could be cancer-causing or other chronic human health effects, significant adverse acute health effects, or significant adverse environmental effects. So this slide summarizes in more detail than what I listed earlier what can trigger whether you need to report TRI for your facility. The first thing is you have to have 10 or more full-time employees. And then if so, is your facility in one of the specified industrial classification codes? And I think we got that slide. Let me see. Yeah, we did. So the next slide, I'm going to identify those SIC codes. And then the third criteria is, do you manufacture more than 25,000 pounds per year of a listed chemical, or do you process more than 25,000 pounds, or do you otherwise use more than 10,000 pounds? A lot of our clients, most of our clients, obviously, that are not straight up, that don't do straight up manufacturing, fall in this third bullet here, the yellow one that I have, and otherwise use or handle on site. Could be anything. It could be something like a diesel that you have in a tank. You're otherwise using it as a fuel. Whereas if you are manufacturing diesel, like as a refinery, you would have a higher limit that would apply. These are the covered FIC codes. Some manufacturing, mining, utilities, electrical utilities, electronic markets, hazardous waste facilities, and then some federal facilities. So most of the clients that we work with kind of fall under the first couple bullets here. Obviously, utilities is another one, and mining. Some of these others that you see down below, the last 4 or 5 bullets, are kind of smaller number of facilities we work with, but a number are kind of fall into the manufacturing or the otherwise use or handle compounds on site. So basically, what is listed on the Form R, which is the TRI form? Similar to the Tier 2, you have the name, location, type of business, the NAICS code, whether the chemical is manufactured, processed, or otherwise used on site, the estimate the maximum quantity that you have on site of the facility, and then the quantity of the chemical entering the air, land, and water annually. And that could be, like I said, air emission, off-site disposal, could be off-site discharge through water also. Then you want to list the off-site locations where the facility transfers these chemicals and the waste treatment disposal methods that are used on the back end of managing these materials. And we'll say Form R. So in 2006, EPA finalized the new TRI rule, which expands the eligibility for use of the Form A, which is a certification statement. Oh, in lieu of the more detailed Form R. Form R is pretty simple, pretty straightforward, but you have to meet the criteria that I have listed here to be able to use the Form A rather than the Form R. The toxic chemical is not a PBT, which you see I have identified down at the bottom, persistent bioaccumulative toxic chemical. Those are identified in the TRI chemical list, which are PBTs and which are not. The facility has an annual reportable amount of less than 2,000 pounds, and the facility manufactures, processes, or otherwise uses less than 1 million pounds. Where can you find the current list of chemicals? This is a screenshot from the EPA website that you can find. You can see that you can download it in a spreadsheet format or in a PDF version. Either of those are easy to search by CAS number or the name of the chemical. I recommend you look up by CAS number sometimes because as we know, there are some synonyms for chemicals out there that you may be looking up as isopropyl alcohol, and it might be listed as the actual other synonym that's used more commonly or less commonly. There are some key things that go into the Form R, the TRI report. You're not just going to be reporting the quantity handled on site. You need to estimate the amount that actually left the facility. And I put a bullet list here of types of calculations that are typically used to determine how much one of these chemicals is left the site. Sometimes you need to use a mass balance. You know how much you bought of a certain raw material, you know how much left in the product, and then you'll estimate the rest went out as waste or air emissions. So you'll use some waste records, you'll use some water discharge records, and maybe analytical for concentration. You may be doing air emission estimating, see how much left by air for examples of things like solvents. You can do air emission calculations to determine how much solvent left the facility through air emissions. Here's another thing again related, another FAQ we have related to lead acid batteries. Again, lead acid batteries are a common thing we see at client sites. That's why I bring it up here first for the Tier 2 and then now for the TRI form. And this is something key. If you have lead acid batteries on site, it doesn't mean that you're automatically subject to TRI. If you had no other chemicals on site, or if you did have other chemicals on site and you want to determine whether you needed to make a report of the lead acid batteries that left in the TRI report, you only have to report the batteries that left the site to be disposed or recycled off site. Any lead acid batteries that you had on site that were in use and continued to be used were not released to the environment in any way, so those would not be considered on the TRI calculations. But let's say you had a number of large forklifts or man lifts and you had batteries that had to be replaced that year and you exceeded the 100-pound threshold for lead, because it's a PBT chemical, then you might have to include these on your Form R for reporting. The lead acid batteries in your vehicles and forklifts that are in use are under what's called the motor vehicle or article exemption. So again, only when you have to switch out batteries, you have to start evaluating whether you need to report or not those items. Okay, I see a good question. Reporting lead acid batteries on the Form R, does this apply if we lease all the vehicles? The answer would be yes. If you have forklifts on site and you're leasing them and you're still switching in and out forklift batteries, that's still an activity that your process is generating and leaving the facility. I've seen some agencies interpret that differently, so it would be good to kind of just confirm with your state agency that oversees the TRI program. I've seen some that say no, if it's leased, then that comes under reporting by the lease company. But that is really rare that would be the case, that company would know what to do under that condition. Good question, Kim. So I also had a little bit here about P2 plan, solution prevention, and TRI. This kind of focuses on a little bit on the Texas side of things, but there are states, in California, they have a waste minimization program called SB14, where you can pull in your biennial report. You can pull in on your SB14, you can pull in your haz waste biennial report, and you can pull in some things under the TRI report if you have those. But it is kind of key to note that that you may require, depending on your state, your locale, you may be required to develop a pollution prevention plan, which is usually related to hazardous waste generation, but it can be tied into your TRI because it is a toxic release. I'm not going to spend much time on that because, again, this is all kind of Texas. So what I'd like to do is get to, this is a summary for the reports we talked about, and then I'll talk about some tools and some methods to help you with EPCRA reporting. So some key things, EPCRA reporting, like I mentioned, there were 4 bullets we had at the beginning. The 311 and 312 are what are called the Tier 2 report, and the Toxic Chemical Release Inventory TRI Form R is 313. It's always good to do like an annual facility-wide inventory of your site to see what chemicals you have on site and whether you're triggering these thresholds. Especially prior to the March 1 deadline, you want to start early, probably like January timeframe, depending on the size of your site. And then for the July 1 deadline for TRI, you might have to gather some information from the year prior as to waste records, wastewater discharge records, and do your mass balances and air emission estimating to determine the calculations for your TRI report. So let's finish up with our last topic here on EPCRA tools and software that'll help you complete reporting. Some clients use the brute force method. You know, I've seen everything from pen and paper to obviously Excel sheets are a pretty good tool to more advanced software programs that are out there. And in some cases, like in California and some of the other states, they have their online system where you do all the reporting and on their system. So let's kind of get into that a little bit. Some kind of key things to think about when you're doing determining your EPCRA reporting. You know, did we have a large increase or decrease? Did we bring a new chemical on site? Do we have a new formulation we're doing? We got rid of hydrofluoric acid. Now we're using nitric acid. You know, those are the types of things to kind of think about and think about how they're going to impact your EPCRA reporting. Did production increase or decrease at the site? Did we have a product that we have mothballed the process and our numbers went down, so TRI probably went down, and even the inventory on site might have gone down, which would impact our Tier 2 reporting. Are you clear what the EPA considers a TRI applicable chemical? Again, going to that website, pulling up the list, and doing a search will help you determine if the items on your chemical inventory, if you need to start looking at the compounds and the thresholds. What are the special requirements for reporting lead acid batteries? We talked around that a little bit. Is the collection of your chemical data on site an easy process? Do you have something from procurement? Do you have something from the manufacturing side that has the inventory or the throughputs of materials coming through? Those are key components that kind of come into play when you're doing your TRI. Or what's the throughput? How much sulfuric acid did we use last year? How much diesel did we use? You're going to have to evaluate these compounds to see if they're greater than the 10,000 or 25,000 pound limits. You know, having a manual versus an electronic system. Obviously, electronic can be quicker, easier. You got to make sure there's no errors in calculations. Make sure it's quality reviewed before you use it. So here's an example of some of the online reporting systems for Tier 2 report. There's something called Tier 2 Submit. About 17 states use that. It's developed by EPA. ePlan, 10 states use that. Tier 2 Manager, 14 states use that. And the other 12 states have custom developed reporting systems. For example, in Texas, we have something called Steers. So there's a number of different systems out there. It depends on the state you're in and which one they'll allow you to use and get online. You'll have to get a username, a password, and submit information using that. If you have a consultant working for you, some states allow you to have an authorized user that can log in, update information, and then the responsible party has to go in and hit submit. Each state, like I said, is different, but that's the generality of how they're typically maintained. Here's the CDX, the federal program, Central Data Exchange. Again, a user ID, a password, and again, you'll have to get authorization from the facility if you're a consultant working for them. A really neat thing BSI developed the last 4 or 5 years is something called the EPCRA compliance tool. It's really helped us with a number of clients to speed up and simplify their EPCRA reporting. What it is, I'll basically summarize, it's a large database of over 40 to 50,000 products. And a product is something that's listed by the common name that is on the SDS. And each product has a chemical makeup in this database. It identifies the amount of each hazardous material, each chemical components, for example, sulfuric acid or ammonia or benzene or whatever it might be. And in there we have the typical concentration or percentage. We have the hazard codes that are required to be filled into these into the Tier 2 submit programs around the U.S. And what we've done is we built a backend on our database that allows you to import the data directly into those programs I had on the other screen, Tier 2 Submit, ePlan, Tier 2 Managers, Steers, and others. So less room for error once you do an automatic data dump, as you call it, as opposed to manually transferring over data that you might do from a spreadsheet or some other system into a state system. We've also been automating calculations for Tier 2 and TRI chemicals, and for HMVP and HMVP for California facilities. So you might ask yourself, what type of calculation do you need? Well, let's say you've got the material is reported in gallons. We can use the density of the material to automatically calculate the pounds and compare to the threshold limit for that compound. There are calculations that go in for the TRI chemicals. Again, it can be based on the mass balance, the waste discharge numbers, etc. And we can do applicability determinations for Tier 2 and TRI chemicals. So I wanted to show you, I've got the next screen here. It might be kind of small for you to see, but some of the outputs are, we get a report that shows whether, this middle one, Tier 2 executive summary. The client gave us the list of compounds they have on site. We put it in our database. We compared what they have to the thresholds for those compounds, and we have a simplified report, 1 or 2 pages long, that says whether a compound that they have is reportable or not. And it's kind of hard to see here, but methanol is reportable, aluminum was reportable, nitric was an EHS, extremely hazardous substance, reportable. So very simple. That is a great way to take a lot of data and simplify what needs to be reported to the client. And then in the same manner for a TRI, we can have an executive summary that kind of spits out on the back end, compares to the limits that are in the TRI chemical database that EPA maintains, and tells us which ones need to be reported for. And in this case, ethylene glycol exceeded, so this facility needed to report for that. And you'll see the very top one is kind of an output that could go to the into the Tier 2 submit type program. Here's examples of some of the types of reports that we have out there. We have where we can download into the California HMVP program in an Excel format that is readily uploadable, has all the hazard codes, all the information is in there, in the order and the detail that the state requires. Under the federal Tier 2, we've got an applicability summary, as I mentioned, an executive summary, a Tier 2 report, and then for TRI, kind of the same thing, applicability summary and the executive summary. Any questions on that? Let's see, there's one hand raised. Okay. Well, that is the end of my presentation. Let me know if you have any questions related to Tier 2 reporting, TRI reporting, any of the topics we talked about today on EPCRA reporting, or if you want to learn more about our EPCRA reporting tool. With that, we can close out today's webinar. Thank you very much for joining us.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes today's webinar. Thank you for your participation. You may now disconnect.